All right, here we go with what is actually the last of the videos for this unit. It's, as you can see, about growth and development. And we're answering this question, where do all these cell types and tissues and organs come from, right? In the last videos, we're talking about how we have all these organs and systems that work together. And then we learned that they're made out of different cell types. Uh, but then how do you go from a single cell to a whole organism? How do you grow and how do you develop into a human? Well, this picture obviously is not of a human, but a lot about what we know about growth and development comes from the study of other animals. This one's called a Drosophila. It's a fruit fly. And it's a simple organism. And so by studying the simple organism, we can learn things that, while they're not exactly the same, for humans, they do apply pretty generally. And so one of the things that we learned from studying this fly is that there are these genes that control its development, that when you want to get a baby fly, you have to grow it, right, from a little bunch of cells into a big animal. And so they figured out that there's these genes called Hox genes that are being shown down over here that control entire sections of the organism. So they figured out that if you mess around with this gene right there, you start to mess around with its mouthpiece right there, right? Or this particular gene controls the front legs, right? They're all color coded to see where they go. Excuse me. And so they start to do experiments on these flies, right? Things you can't do on humans to see what would happen. For example, in this particular fly, they have made legs grow out of the spot where the antenna is, because they turned off those antenna genes, which would be in the brown section, and instead they moved some genes around and made the green genes active in that spot, right? So instead of getting antennas to grow, you get legs to grow. This one has a bunch of different versions of eyes. Some of them are just straight missing. Some of them have extra pieces. This one that just showed up has extra wings. All these mutations that they made by controlling not one specific gene for one little tiny detail, but these genes that control big chunks of the development of an organism, right? And so that's interesting because they work on the same level that we work. They are made out of organ systems that are then made out of organs, and the organs are made out of tissues, and the tissues are made out of cells. And those cells have to all work together to make the different tissues that make the organs, that make the systems, that make you, right? So the idea is that you as one organism are a bunch of little pieces that all work together. But the hard part comes from the fact is that you are a very complicated organism, even way more complicated, of course, than that the fruit fly that we just saw. And so when you talk about growing legs in front of your antenna, that's not something that you would do for a human. But what if, in the future, you lost an arm and then you would want to grow your arm back? Like, that is a problem for growth and development. You need to grow a whole arm. But as the picture is trying to show you here, it's not just an arm, right? You're not growing one thing. You are growing millions and millions and millions of cells, and those cells are all very different. So when you grow an arm, what you're really talking about is growing bones that are the right length and in the right spot, growing muscles that attach to those bones in the right spot, putting nerves that go through there so you can control the movements, right? All these different things. Your arm is made out of tons of different types of tissues and cells. And so this is what you were doing in the lab from the last activity, where you had to look at things like this. This is a human neuron, and you saw inside of there that it has things like a nucleus, which most of them have. They all have cytoplasm and a cell membrane, but like, for example, the neuron has things called axons and dendrites. These are long, like branching tails that come off of the cell, and that's what the cell uses to connect to each other so that the brain cells can talk to each other, right? And that's special to brain cells. Only brain cells have those because that's their job. Meanwhile, a skin cell doesn't have a whole heck of a lot to do other than just sit there and form the wall. So when you look at the skin cell, it looks a lot just like a bricks, right? Making a wall. It doesn't have anything really special because it just doesn't do a whole lot of special things. The muscle cell we'll talk about in just a second, but it's interesting because the muscle cell doesn't really have cells. The cells all fuse together to make one big cell that has lots of different nuclei. There's more than one nucleus on these cells because the cells all kind of group together to make one big cell. Or the red blood cells, which didn't have a nucleus at all because their job is to carry oxygen. For that, you need this protein called hemoglobin. And so the red blood cells are completely full of hemoglobin, just 100% packed with the molecule that carries oxygen. There's no room for a nucleus. And so this is one reason why red blood cells only live like a day, in some cases less than a day, because they don't have a lot going on with them. They're just these like vehicles that carry oxygen and things, right? But the idea is that you have all kinds of different types of cells, and they're all shaped differently and made differently because they have different jobs, right? And so our question again is, where does this come from? How do we grow the organs? This is something called mitosis. That mitosis will make us new cells, but then we also need them to be specialized. We need them to do things that are unique. And so we need them to differentiate, or develop is the word for it. So of course, this all starts with fertilization. You need a sperm and the egg, right? This is something that we learned already before. Both of these pictures show lots of sperms trying to get into one egg. Only one sperm can get into the egg, and that makes this thing called a zygote, which is where the first cell is officially created, right? In this diagram, I'm trying to show you that the sperm right here is trying to get its way in. It's got to fight its way in through these layers until when it finally does, it releases its nucleus, and then the sperm is just like empty, right? Like the sperm itself is just kind of a vehicle that drops off half of the DNA. The egg nucleus is the other half, and then you get your first real nucleus, your first zygote. But that's how every cell, every organism starts, from one cell, just like that. But then we have to go from that into trillions and trillions and trillions of cells, right? And so now we have to grow more cells. So this all happened probably right about here. This is called the fallopian tube, and this is the ovary, and the egg comes out of the ovary and starts to work its way towards the uterus, and the uterus is where the baby will grow. The sperm are going the opposite way. They're coming in, the egg's going out, and then they would meet somewhere in here, and then you would get fertilization, right? But then we got to take that cell that was one cell and turn it into two cells. Again, this is called mitosis, and we already learned this other thing called meiosis. I'm not going to make you go through mitosis again, but the idea is that if we make copies of our DNA and then we line up those copies and we split them into two cells, you'll get two exact cells that are the same as the beginning cell, right? By making them copy, by making them line up, and then you pull them apart, and then you have two cells. You might remember making a video about this. So the one cell turns into two cells, and then the two cells turn into four cells, and the four cells turn into 8 cells, and then into whatever, 16 cells. And it just keeps going and going until it makes this ball of cells. And this whole time it's called an embryo because it's just this clump of cells. And all those cells are, for the most part, completely exactly the same because all you've been doing is making copies and copies and copies, right? So here's a quick animation. I don't know how well these things show up on the Zoom video like this, but of the cells splitting in half, right? Inside of them, there's this mitosis stuff that's happening where they're copying the DNA and it's lining up, but you can't see all that stuff. Now, that is going to keep going. We're now at this ball of cells right here, but they're all kind of the same. And then it's going to do this weird folding thing where the inside parts are going to start to push up inside of it. That's what it's trying to show you here to make this thing called a gastrula. Part of the assignment this week is for you to look at this kind of thing, right? And so this is the part where they have to start to specialize. Now, in real life, of course, they're not actually colored like this, but the colors help us to show what's happening. That about 7 to 10 days after the fertilization, stuff is going to start to happen, where the cells are going to start to decide what they're going to make. And then once they start to just specialize, then they can go back to just making lots and lots of copies of them, right? And so then once they specialize, they grow to make tissues, and then the tissues create the organs and so forth. Let's move my head again. Right? And so how can one cell be different from the other? One of the important things about biology that we've learned already is that every cell has the same DNA. So we can't go around just cutting and pasting our DNA depending on the situation. We want every single cell to have the same DNA. but they have to act differently. And so what we really want to do is turn on and off parts of the gene. This is called gene expression, sorry, parts of the DNA, parts of the chromosome, right? Think of it as light switches. If I'm a muscle cell, I want to turn on first the major light that says, all right, we're all going to be muscle cells. Then once that light switch has been turned on, then we can select more and more specific things. All right, now I really got to turn this part on, and oh, we need some of that. This might keep going, so more and more switches get flipped, but the more switches you flip, the more specialized the cell will become. Meanwhile, while all these, let's say, muscle cell genes are being turned on, other genes, for say your liver or your skin or your brain, those are going to get turned off because we don't want those turning on, right? So the big idea about this is that cells only use the instructions that they want. Again, if you think of the instructions, the DNA, as a big, say, like recipe book, and you have the recipes to make every single thing, but you only run like an Italian food restaurant, you're only going to use those recipes and you're not going to use the other ones, right? And so that's kind of what your cells are doing. All the other things are inactive. So I'm going to use an example of muscles. These are called chromosome maps, and it tells you where certain genes are found on certain chromosomes. And right up here on chromosome number 7, I believe, is a gene for something called actin. This is the recipe to make a protein called actin. And down here happens to be another recipe for a gene for something called myosin. And these are important because they make up your muscles. Actin and myosin are the filaments, the long stringy strands that make up your muscles, right? And so we only want those long stringy things to be turned on in our muscles because we don't usually want to grow random stringy proteins, say again, in the middle of your brain cells, because that's going to make them not work very well. So if you really like drill down on what a muscle is made out of these fibers. But if you look at that fiber, they're actually made out of even smaller fibers. But then those fibers are even made up of smaller fibers until you get finally down to the one cell like level. And if you look inside there, there's all these strings, and that's the actin and the myosin. Oh, all these things should have been coming up already, right? So here's a really close-up of how the strings are interlaid. You have your myosin in the middle right here, and then you have the actin on the sides. And the actin is like the rope, and the myosin is like the worker. When you're ready to contract your muscles, the myosin will reach out and grab the rope, which is the actin, and actually pull it. Hopefully you can see this again on the videos when I make it. But when it pulls, it makes this part go in and this part go in. And so the muscle fiber gets smaller. And when it gets smaller, it makes your muscle contract, and then your arm moves or whatever it is that you want it to do. Right, so we need all these fibers, again, that are going to make this part to get smaller, but then we're going to pull those ends smaller, and there's every one of these lines is a set of these fibers that pull and get smaller and smaller and smaller. So again, in a muscle cell, we want those genes to be turned on. We need those if we want to move our muscles. In a nervous system cell, we do not want those things to be turned on. Right? So if you were to go to the DNA in your brain, those sections of your DNA have been shut off or turned off so that they don't make anything. However, in your brain, you do want to make this stuff called serotonin. This is a chemical that makes you feel happy, actually. And one of the things that it does a lot of things. But we want that to be expressed in our brain. We do not want it to be expressed in our muscles, right? So each cell has its unique set of genes that are turned on and off so it could do its specific job. Of course, in the end, this makes them look and act completely different. So finally, this all happened going way back to the ball of cells, right? The blue cells have all had certain switches that say, all right, you're going to basically be the linings of things, the outside of the skin, but also the lining of the mouth and your other organs. It's interesting, I think, that your brain comes from the same part that your skin comes from. But all the cells in the blue have things in common with them. At first, they would all be somewhat similar to each other, but then as they go along, they get more and more specialized. The part in the red becomes kind of like your middle sections. This is your muscles and your skeleton, right? So we already made the outer and the inner layers, and now we get the middle layer, which is your muscles. And then the endoderm is like the organs, especially your inside organs, like your liver. right? So you don't have to know much of the details of this. The idea is just that during this stage of development, about a week in, the cells start to decide what they're going to be, and they flip on their switches based on what they're eventually going to become. Then the final step before it starts to actually turn into like a fetus, which is what you would call it once it looks like a real animal, is something called neurulation. And this is an interesting thing that people are still trying to study how it happens. But the whole big ball starts to change its shape, and it starts to fold on itself so that it can make a neural tube, right? So if you kind of look here, it's like the tube is starting to form, and eventually it's going to keep going until it makes a full circle, right? And so the whole ball of cells is kind of changing its shape so that it can make the basic idea of an animal. And so hopefully this video comes out okay. I'll probably link it somewhere else, but this is going to show the development of a tadpole. And so you had the one cell that splits into two and then four. It happened real fast. It's just more and more cell divisions, more and more mitosis. Here's the gastrulation where it starts to fold in on itself. And you can imagine here's where the layers start to form. This is the neurulation where the big thing is wrapping around itself to make this tube that runs down its back. And that's its back, right? And you can kind of see its back now. And now it's about to start to actually look like an animal. And you can start to see where its head is. It's changing too fast for me to do anything, but you can see its head and its tail are already forming. And then more and more growth happens and more development happens. I think there's sound on this thing. And eventually you get a fully grown and developed tadpole, which of course then needs to grow and develop more to be a frog, but that's a whole nother story. Right? But again, that whole thing basically happens to humans. One of the things that we saw in the evolution section is that animals from fish all the way up to mammals all kind of have the same beginnings, and it all kind of works in that same way. And so that is one of the things that you will talk about or you will investigate in the final assignment, where you would go to the good old Gizmo website, which is over here, and you would click on the one that says embryo development. And it looks like that, right? And so you have two sets of things to do. Of course, this is all on the document that you'll get from the links. But it'll walk you through how to go through, and you can look at the stages as they start to develop and things like that. The more difficult one is the second and third parts, where it goes into differentiation. This is where the ball cell starts to change into, or the single cell turns into the ball and all that stuff, right? So it's important that you notice that there's that in activity 2, you're under investigation mode. But then, and when you do that, you do these things and it just shows you what's happening. It's not going to explain a whole lot because you have to investigate. But if you go then step 3, it's the summary. And the summary like shows you labels, and it talks to you and it tells you things that are happening, right? So don't get confused there. One other tip I wanted to point out, or in case you didn't know, is that there are these sections here on the worksheet where it wants you to fill them in, right? If you were doing this on paper, you can still fill them in though, even though it's electronic, because when you click on it, it says edit, and when you edit that, it takes you to this little deal, and I can just come in here and like if I start to type stuff in there, like it types, right? And then when I hit save and close, then it's there. I'm gonna delete that now so I don't mess up everybody's thing. But you can do that too. And so just like before, you go through the worksheet, it tells you which buttons to press and in which order and what to look for. And then you turn it into PowerSchool when you are done. Let me know if you have any problems. Otherwise, good luck.